Well, thank you very much, Joe. I appreciate the introduction. And hello and welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for joining us for today's panel discussion. Today, we have an exciting panel of ophthalmic business leaders who will discuss what it takes to be successful in Europe. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our very prestigious panel. In alphabetical order, we have Fabrizio Cines, Chairman and CEO of CIFI. Fabrizio has almost 20 years of experience at CIFI across many different leadership roles and has been fundamentally at the heart of the CIFI story for that time.
Fabrizio also has very significant first-hand experience of bringing innovation into the challenging European environment.
Next, I'd like to welcome Tim Clover, CEO of Retina. Tim has been a senior leader in ophthalmology market for over 20 years, both in the industry and from an investment and investment management perspective. Today, as CEO of Retina, Tim will lead the company on the next leg of its journey since the recent acquisition of a majority stake by private equity house CVC. Nice to have you on the panel, Tim. Then we have Luis Iglesias. Luis is president and head of EMEA at Santen, and he's also a corporate officer. Luis has 30 years of experience in the pharma and medical device industry, 10 years of senior leadership roles in ophthalmology in Europe, both at Allergan and now at Santen. Next, we have Karen Netherton. Karen is Global Patient Access Head, Ophthalmology at Novartis. Karen has over 20 years of experience in medical affairs, government affairs, and market access. Currently, Karen leads a team of professionals in health economics, market access, and real-world evidence focused on ophthalmology products from the very early stages of development through post-launch. Lastly, but not least, we have Syed Rashid. Syed is Director of Market Access, Sales Training at Johnson & Johnson Division. Syed has more than 25 years experience in healthcare, more than 10 years experience in market access, always with a focus on Europe. And much of that time, his emphasis was on the ophthalmic marketplace. So thank you very much to the panelists for joining us today. We're looking forward to a very exciting discussion. If we start and if we think about the European economic area, and of course, Europe really goes beyond the definition of the European economic area. We have a population of over 500 million people. It's a substantial market. And yet it's made up of at least 31 countries, introducing tremendous complexity in terms of coordination of innovation, regulatory harmonization, and market access. So while organizations like the European Medicines Agency, as well as certain European centralized funding mechanisms for innovation exist and have addressed some of these challenges, many challenges still exist for us. So what is the secret to being successful in Europe? I'd like to open today's discussion by turning to Tim and Fabrizio, both leaders of quintessentially European companies in ophthalmology. Both of your companies have a heritage of innovating in the sector, and whether or not you have or have ambitions beyond Europe, much of your history has been based on success in Europe. What do you feel is behind that success? And was there anything uniquely European behind your success? Fabrizio, why don't you start?
Thank you, Mark. And apologize, but let me start with a joke. These days, it's easy to say that being Italian is key to be successful in Europe. And I apologize to the English colleague that is joining team, but that was overdue. Jokes aside, I guess that in Europe versus other regions in the world like the US, you need to be looking at the sides of the opportunity, and therefore there is a mix of attitude towards risk that you have to take. So if you look at innovation starting from the early phase, you might want to take more risk by taking on ideas, patents from inventors, or even ophthalmologists, and then invest on those before they get to any kind of commercial proof of concept. And this is something that we've actually done in the past, especially when I look at our history brief history in the business of intraocular lenses. However, when it comes to the commercial rollout, I think you have to be more risk averse, if you like, because of the fragmentation of the European market, if you're starting from here. And of course, the difficulties you have in market access and, let's say, generally speaking, pricing, fragmentation, and the issues that you basically get in setting up perhaps a new organization in countries that you do not operate within yet, and therefore, you have to take into account that it will take longer to get the return on investment compared to what you would do once you have a commercial proof of concept in markets like the US. So I would say, all in all, being smaller, you have to be more careful in some respect and more aggressive on other respects.
Tim, how do you see this from Reina's perspective?
I think there's been probably two characteristics specifically about Europe and innovation. The first, I think, overwhelmingly the largest is regulatory affairs. If I look back to our own history over 100 years, it was only 1949. That's not that long ago. But Sir Harold Ridley and Reina fashioned the first IOL out of perspex and implanted it in a patient. And there was actually no gap between making the IOL and it going into a patient's eye. Move forward 70 years, and particularly this year, and just the enormous retarding effect of regulatory affairs on innovation in Europe is there for all to see. So I think innovation in Europe primarily was driven by this easy access to the market in early years, and that is almost certainly subsiding as we look to the future. The other area I would say is that lots of people I've heard refer to Europe as a market. I don't think it is a market; it's a collection of smaller markets, and it suits an SME mentality like ourselves. I think agility, flexibility, the ability to respond to product preferences, reimbursements, cultural differences is particularly relevant to an organization of our size. And I think that's one of the competences we've been able to bring to this.
Great. I'm very curious, Luis, I wanted to direct a question to you. Santen has obviously looked towards internationalization for many years now. In fact, you started in 1993 by establishing an R&D and a business development base in the US. But the company launched its commercial activity first in Europe, specifically in Germany in 1994. And then since that date, you've established manufacturing facilities in Finland. And
you've done a couple of acquisitions, specifically the Novagali acquisition in France and the Merck portfolio subsequently. And you've done numerous R&D deals. So your commercial momentum in Europe was really tremendously strong. And yet in the US, it seems like you're just picking up now with the recent acquisitions that you've done. So what is from Santen's perspective, what was it that led to Santen to really establish that commercial activity in Europe first?
Well, first of all, Santen is 130 years old. The company started in 1890 in Japan. And it remained a Japanese company for many years. And as you very well said, it was actually in the 1970s, where we acquired a manufacturing plant in Finland. And then subsequently, we acquired an R&D business in France, Novagali. We then acquired the rights for the MSD, the Merck sharpened down glaucoma products in Europe. We then signed, I'm glad that we got an Italian today, on board. We signed 2 deals with Italian companies that specializes in dry eye to market dry eye products across Europe, and then NTC, another Italian company. We signed a deal with Infocus for a medical device to be used in glaucoma, and again, Europe has been the first region to not just launch but drive the global programs for this product. We just signed a deal with a company called J-Cell, which does cell therapy based in California for an unmet need in retinitis pigmentosa. And again, this was a European deal. So what we have seen is maybe a consequence of sometimes opportunistic, sometimes strategic decisions where Europe was driving the business setup. And as a consequence, we were probably in a much better place than the United States to close deals. I have more than 700 employees in the region dedicated to ophthalmology versus the United States, where we were just setting up the business. And as you well said, in California, we do have an R&D arm, but it was not really the strong commercial organization that we have in Japan or in Europe. Now, we also have been fortunate enough to see competitors leave the ophthalmology floor, like Pfizer, like MSD, partially Novartis. So in Europe, we have become a much stronger company within the pharmaceutical business. And that has kind of catapulted us to where we are today within Santen globally. Now, about the US, we just signed a deal to buy a company in the United States called Ivans. This was set up by ex-Alcon leaders in Texas. And Ivans is becoming now our platform to enter the United States. And in fact, only 3 weeks ago, we got our first approval for a cyclosporin in the United States called Vercasia to be used in AKC. So we're starting to ramp up our operations in the United States. But we done it in the way Japanese companies do things. We like to think things carefully. We look at the opportunities globally, and then we execute when we think is the right time to execute. It is a culture that is very different to American companies or European companies. But as it was said earlier on, we do understand the fragmentation in Europe extremely well. And we do opportunistically enter those markets depending on whether we feel it's the right thing to do or not. And that's no different to being a European, Italian, or US company. We have learned to do that. But it's been an evolution, and that will continue. No doubt the United States will be a big platform for us over the next 10 years. But we have taken all the learnings from Asia and Europe into the US as we set up the next step of our strategy.
Understanding that fragmentation is really, perhaps at the heart of being successful in Europe. It provides a competitive advantage, and I suppose, Tim, Fabrizio, and Luis, as European companies, that must be one of the key components of your success strategy.
I think so. I'm not sure over the. I'm not sure. I don't see it consolidating over the sort of next period. I think it's been a historic attribute of Europe, but I think as we look forward, there's this sort of inevitable trend towards, some kind of single regulatory standard, and I think that probably reduces the differences that we've almost enjoyed in the past. I don't know if people think the same.
Yeah, I started just to say I totally agree with that, and the new MDR will have a lot to do with that as well, to be honest.
Yeah, I think what I can add to that, Mark, is that innovation takes place anywhere in the world. You don't have to be based in California or in France to bring innovation. I think that's a very old-fashioned way to look at R&D. And innovation. We've seen, when I discuss with you some of the things that we've been working on recently and deals that come from all aspects. We've got partnerships with universities, partnerships with small companies, opportunities from large companies that don't necessarily want that portfolio anymore. I think you're asking what is the trick, or what is the essence to be successful in Europe, and I would say that having the agility to move quickly, and we have heard some good examples already of that agility in European companies, together with having people that can adapt quickly to the changes, is fundamental. And I feel in my experience, Europeans are very good at that. We can move from one country to another and adapt. We can learn other languages and adapt. We can take other cultures and adapt, probably better than other regions. And that is part of the essence for success. I think most of our colleagues know how to deal with people from the United States, from Asia. We learn their cultures. We learn how to negotiate with individuals there. That is not always the same when you deal with people from other regions. So I think there is an essence that we have within Europe, within people from Europe. Our borders are close. Today I'm in London, but my office is in Geneva, and my second home in Spain. And who knows where I am today? Nobody knows. That's how we live in Europe. We can move from one place to another. You have Italians running companies, French, Germans, Spanish. So that diversity, I believe, is part of our success. And I think that will continue. That agility, flexibility, and talent that we have in the region is part of our big success story.
Yeah.
I think agility is absolutely critical here, but also the flexibility to really understand that I think it was Tim who said Europe is not one mass entity. The fact that, the union is 27 different countries, all with different reimbursement requirements. Yes, from a harmonization, from a regulatory perspective, it's getting better, but we still have multiple timings. We have Germany who will provide access to medicines from day one. You've got Italy, Spain, 24 months later, you're still working on your reimbursement. And I think to be very opportunistic, and I think it was Fabrizio actually who said that, to really understand what the European markets are and how do you prioritize those assets. And Novartis, who is also a very large European company based in Basel, we cut our teeth in retina and in ophthalmology in Europe with Lucentis, and really began to really understand how the motivations go with ophthalmology. So I think it's very dangerous to suggest that it's one marketplace. It's definitely a continent, and it definitely provides opportunities, but just like Asia or other areas in the world, their very diversity is what's required in order to really survive here.
Great, thank you. I'd like to come back to one point you raised, Luis, before regarding innovation, that innovation, doesn't have to be in one place. Innovation is something that's applicable broadly, right? So it doesn't matter where something was developed, it can be applied in a number of locations. And yet, today we still see a trend of, a lot of companies placing their worldwide R&D centers in hubs like Boston. Earlier in the meeting today, we heard from Luis Diaz-Santana from Cambridge Consultants, who was talking about the importance of innovation networks. I'd like to ask a little bit more, explore that point a little bit more. Does Europe need to do something different in order to compete better in terms of innovation? Or is the fact that we're very strongly networking across countries and across centers, that's already a differential advantage for us? Are there approaches to innovation that are uniquely suitable or needed in Europe, or are we already getting it right? It's an open question to the panel.
So I'm going to jump in again, seeing as I finished the last one. Thanks, Mark. I really struggle with the innovation networks question. Yes, absolutely. There's definitely a hub in Boston. There's also a hub here in Basel. There are hubs all over Europe that exist to smaller degrees. But to suggest that there aren't any hubs in Europe is just, I think, one of the best kept secrets. I think some of the most innovative companies I know that we've looked at from a partnership perspective have come out of Europe.
Shall I jump in, Mark? I think there's the whole concept of sort of innovation hubs, to me, sounds a little bit contrived. That if we do this, innovation will happen. Excuse me. I don't think it's down to that. I think it's down to individuals and the culture of companies, which drives innovation. I think what you need to do is foster the environment and the culture to make that happen. And, one of the things I always lament about the UK, and I think applies to some of the wider European structures, is their inability to deploy their effectively social centralized healthcare systems as a tool to medical device and pharmaceutical companies in clinical studies and clinical trials. As a Brit, if I look back on this whole vaccine creation episode, I think the NHS was outstanding in being able to recruit patients, organize studies, at times unseen by anybody. I don't understand why that can't be harnessed and created for organizations who want to fast track the kinds of studies that we all need now to be able to get products on the market. So I would love to see some kind of systemic, government-orientated access to the healthcare systems across Europe, which would allow those fast-track clinical investigations to take place.
I mean, of course, in Europe, we have those public healthcare systems, which is an infrastructure that doesn't exist everywhere. So to be able to utilize those makes an awful lot of sense.
But we all go somewhere else for our clinical studies because we know the organization and the priority and the structure to organize them isn't there.
Yeah.
I would say that what Tim is saying right now is very true. But I'll also say that the days when the R&D department of pharmaceutical companies was bringing 99 to 100% of the new products are over. I think that companies that hang on to 7, 8, 10% of their sales into an R&D and a big component into R are missing what's going on everywhere else. And what we do see definitely in pharmaceuticals is a better the development within the company following an external earlier stage acquisition or partnership with somebody else. Because there's stuff going on in Singapore right now, really good science taking place in southern parts of California. There's really good science in France, in ophthalmology, in the Benelux. And you can't just say, well, it's just Basel, or it's just Boston, or it's just Arizona or Texas. So I think you have to have your eyes open. You have to have, it's a bit like going to the casino. You have to play your chips in more than just one or two numbers, because that was one single small bet could be the one that makes the difference. So the ability to have a team within business development that is as strong as the research and development team is fundamental now for success. And the BD guys have been always very difficult to recruit. I think most of us will have a struggle. There's no such thing as a career in business development. There's a career in research, but business development, you end up there sometimes by accident. But the reality is that understanding what's happening in other companies, in other parts of the world, is fundamental for the growth of a company. And clearly, when I look at Santen today, we have a much better balance than we had 130 years ago, 50 years ago, in terms of what comes from our internal R&D, what comes from outside, and then we develop ourselves. And that is part of the success for Europe as well, for the future, our ability to fund research centers, universities that can bring that earlier stage to us, and then we can take it to the next level.
Yeah, if I may chip in at this stage, I think, we heard a lot of interesting points and very agreeable, especially if you take them from the company standpoint. But when it comes to the original point of what Europe does need to do, I guess Tim had a very good point there, where, we have this, I would say, very good healthcare system that are paid by public governments. So you have this tendency on price containment across the board of pharmaceuticals and devices, and also considering the next stage of, let's say, funding coming from the EU. I think we should try and find ways to develop those national healthcare systems as assets to basically do the clinical trials, provide a kind of partner for companies to develop new products. And I think we have a lot of competencies there. We have also hunger for money. And if you can direct those funds into that direction, I think Europe could really, become a more competitive environment to foster those innovation networks, basically making a better use of the assets that it has already available, which is, again, this national healthcare systems that we have across the different countries. And this requires a change of mentality, and generally speaking, what we would call in a company or in a private organization, change management towards those who will administer those funds and those who will make their career out of this new perspective on innovation.
It's interesting. I think pricing and funding in in national healthcare systems is absolutely a challenge in Europe. I'm always trying to find the glass half full versus half empty sort of perspective. And for me, I think one of the things that we as an ophthalmology community need to do a better job of is working with governments to actually make ophthalmology one of the priority areas of healthcare. I think ophthalmology is one of the areas where you see so much that is unfunded, whether you start with prescription glasses, anything beyond the basics of an IOL, all the way through to pharmaceutical products and dry eye, et cetera. And how do we make sure that the persons dealing with ophthalmological conditions are as prioritized as other areas of the healthcare system?
Yeah, I can only agree with that. I had down the key for us moving forward post the pandemic as well is that there'll be more openness, I think, for collaboration and partnership, and we've got to treat the problem as a whole rather than from excuse the pun, a single lens perspective, in terms of what suits just us, because I think, one of the things that we're seeing in our field of elective surgery in cataract, for example, there has been lots of cancellations in cataract, in women's health as well. We're seeing things have stopped. So there is an urgency within the European healthcare system to come up with how they're going to deal with the backlog and the challenges that exist within the different fragmented public healthcare systems. And I believe that by partnership and openness, this is the right time to do it, because people are ready to go back to work, so to speak, and integrate rather than live our lives in the way that we've lived in the last 2 years. So
let me change the topic just a little bit, and if we think about some of the fundamental differences between Europe and the US in terms of market accessibility. Firstly, obviously, we have the fundamental differences in terms of actual product development. Europe has always been more difficult for the clinical development of pharmaceutical products, given that placebo-controlled trials are not usually seen as sufficient for approval, not always, but not usually. And on the other hand, for medical devices, achieving the required CE mark was always more straightforward than the corresponding US procedure. Now, of course, that gap is closing with the new MDR, but that was historically the situation. And then secondly, of course, from market access perspective itself, and market access and reimbursement has always been a tremendous challenge in Europe because of the non-harmonization between the different countries. And frankly, sometimes even at a national level, there are regional market access differences that need to be coped with. So it was always complex. And then, of course, the lower price points that generally exist in Europe compared to the US, that's enough to make anyone think twice about whether or not they would want to come to Europe. So, as we think about this, and we've touched on some of these points, but what is the winning way to see these challenges and how do companies address them? And I'd love to hear, your perspective, Karen, on this, with respect to Novartis, and how does it ensure success in Europe from an early stage of development? So it's not just obviously about once you're in the market, one has to plan for this from the earliest stages of development. What is the approach you take?
Yeah, so thank you. I will answer your question in a second, Mark, but I will address your non-harmonization comment and be careful what you wish for. Being Canadian, we did have non-harmonization, and when they harmonized across Canada, we essentially came down to the lowest common denominator. So, we really want to be careful as what we advocate for and what we want to, particularly the largest market in Europe, Germany, providing complete access from day one. Definitely wouldn't want to see delays any further in that piece. So
absolutely.
it's never as simple as it seems. But to answer your question with regards to, in Novartis, we're very lucky. We have 5 therapeutic areas in ophthalmology. We have a long history, we believe now, in ophthalmology, and one with a growing pipeline. And also with some potential acquisition targets as well, namely the most recent one, I guess, being Luxturna. So we work very closely and have to work very closely from day one with the development organization. No longer is it just looking at patient outcomes and the regulatory requirements in order to demonstrate approvability, because in Europe, with approvability without any market access becomes challenging. Although I think the other thing that makes, as I mentioned earlier, ophthalmology quite interesting is really understanding what your marketplace is. Ophthalmology, particularly in pharmaceuticals, is not all public reimbursement. So how do we then really understand and segment from an early stage which of those are truly for the government healthcare system and which of them may not be? And then what are the strategies and the patient outcomes that we need to collect moving forward?
Great. And Syed, I'd be really interested to hear a little bit of the story regarding J&J, which has always had a strong presence in Europe, both commercially and through its innovation footprint. From J&J's perspective, how is Europe different to your other markets, and what do you feel the key to success is, especially thinking about these market accessibility questions?
Thanks for the question, Mark. Yes, so we as J&J as a company are very committed to Europe, but if we focus in on our surgical vision business in particular, the examples I can talk about obviously are our R&D footprint exists in 2 places within Europe. One is in Groningen in the Netherlands, which is where our IOLs have been developed, and many patients across the world have benefited from innovation, as well as our R&D colleagues that has developed the technology there. And the other area is Uppsala, which is in Sweden, where our OVD is manufactured. So, from a manufacturing and R&D perspective, that's all good. And then from a customer experience perspective, we have a sort of vision experience center in Barcelona, in Spain. So, where we can show our technologies to customers across Europe, and people can be educated and learn how our systems work and so forth. So we're very fortunate from that perspective. And the points that have been made by the other panelists is this: the beauty about Europe is its diversity. Right, and I think the diversity has been a huge learning for a company like J&J in terms of how we operate and how we bring product to market. So, and at the same time, being able to sort of understand the differences in reimbursement systems, but within the public sector, we do see some form of leveling out with regards to cataract reimbursement, I would say. And also we're seeing more of an introduction of bilateral surgery now with in the public segment post the COVID and new data that's come out regarding that. And the key, again, to our success, I would say, in Europe has been to living our credo values, which we're, very committed to, and the people that we employ locally. And I think the local employment of people helps us to understand, the differences of cultural differences. And I think Louise made a point that Europeans are quite good and adaptable to move around and inquisitive, I guess, in nature as well, to learn about different cultures.
Great. You brought up a few trends, in the European marketplace, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about trends as well. What are the trends that are shaping the future of the ophthalmic market in Europe? An obvious trend that is occurring as we speak is the migration from the medical device directive to the medical device regulation, which is also obviously a tightening of the regulation as a consequence of some of the medical device issues outside of ophthalmology, as it turns out, that have occurred over the past years. How do you all see these changes impacting the industry? I mean, tightening regulation could always be viewed as very positive when it comes to safety, but in general, how do you see these regulatory changes with a view to the overall industry performance in Europe?
Just to follow on from the conversation that we started, if it's okay, I'd like to answer that from an MDR point of view. We welcome the MDR, and we were quite involved in the MDR creation, and largely, like pharmaceuticals, the quality of evidence is going to be needed is going to be greater, so it gives people more of an opportunity to show and meet an unmet need, and level 1, level 2 evidence is going to be more critical rather than just being able to just get CE mark and off you go. And this was one of maybe the attractions of coming to Europe was that, but I think that now you will see, like in the US, like you have ID studies and stuff like that, there'll be tighter regulation to make sure that, that what is coming to market is addressing an unmet need. At the same time, there is some real evidence behind why there should be a step change. And if I could go a bit further about the MDR is that for the first time now, patients will be given implant cards. So, so that again, we welcome, because it means, that patients will be more aware of what's being put in. If you take the IOL, the patient wasn't aware what IOL was used, but now with the MDR, you will see that with implant cards, with ePIL, which gives you access to knowing patients being educated about the IOL, and the point that Karen made is that we have a two system where you have a public system and you have a private system as well, and then within the private system, patients need to be educated, and this is a good kickoff towards that, I would say, and you'll see new payment mechanisms coming in France, for example, within the medical device area of Article 51, which is basically a new payment mechanism, and they are trialing outcomes payments for cataract patients over the next 4 years, and it's led by an organisation called PromTime. So I think it is more focused on making sure that we're all doing the right thing and the quality increasing and reducing the variation.
Thanks. Any other thoughts?
So you're the person responsible, Syed, right? I mean, I think that what you're guaranteed to get with MDR is less products on the market and a slower rate of innovation, guaranteed. What you're not guaranteed to get, and I have to say I'm amused that I've never seen any target set for this, is better product performance and improved safety. It's just an assumption that those things might come as an association with the MDR, but we'll definitely get less products and slower innovation. I think a corollary of that is that if you look around the world, you made the comment earlier, Mark, that Europe has pretty low pricing compared to the US, compared to China, compared to Japan. There's a coincidence, all of those markets are very highly regulated. So the other trend I would point to, if all of us sat around this table are economically rational, is a significant price increase for medical devices in Europe over the coming 5 years in response to the associated costs of placing them on the market.
If I may chip in at this stage, I think, the perspectives on the MDR are, of course, different, whether you are an SME or a large organization. But I would say that what is common among the companies that are represented here, that we all strive for quality. Which means efficacy and safety. And you could also argue from one end that the safety of devices in Europe has not been proved as less relevant than the US, and you have more options for patients and surgeons in Europe, at least in cataract surgery. Having said that, this is a discussion that is, I would say, no longer very relevant. I think if we move on from the implant side to the dry eye devices space, we're actually in a very uncertain scenario, because the way the European Commission has in its own hands, without the need to go through the trilogy, the definition of pharmacological effect, which could potentially render all of the artificial tears that we use in Europe as no longer compliant with the definition of a device. And, CIFI has artificial tears that are also registered as drug products. So, it's not a self-defense. What I'm saying is that beyond the disruptive innovation that you see in many areas of medicine and also in ophthalmology, there is the concept of incremental innovation, which has been key so far in making Europe a shall we call it test bed for future developments in richer markets such as the US? Of course, you can say that you can have different views on that. But certainly what we know is that this is going to change with the MDR. We have to face it. And I guess we should ask as an industry, and I come back to the point of Karen, to some sort of more care about the overall health of the pharma and medical device industry. Considering that ophthalmology, unfortunately, is not considered as critical care, and actually, at least when it comes to the way money would be deployed in Italy out of the EU Next Gen fund, ophthalmology, the national healthcare system will be almost excluded from that funding. So we do face a lot of challenges going ahead, and these trends have to be followed.
Any other comments?
I think the only comment I could add to that, and I think it's been well covered, is that, at least from Santen's point of view, focusing on the regulatory approval as the main milestone in drug and device development will probably result in launches that significantly underperform expectations and potentially failure. We do believe that we have to adapt and develop studies that generate data that support not just the regulatory authority, but the payer, ultimately, whoever that payer happens to be. And very often, especially when you enter partnerships, external partnerships, people are focusing too much sometimes on the innovation, look at what I have got, rather than who is going to pay for it. So I'm not too worried so much about the MDD to MDR. There's some challenges that have been going on in regulatory affairs for many years. I'm more worried about the evolution of the payer and how that constantly changes. And you go now 3 stages: approval of your product, reimbursement of your product, and maintenance of that reimbursement, which means don't have cuts out of the blue and you don't expect, which may mean that another country next door also cut the price. And then another one starts bringing the product from another country and so on. So there's a kind of cascade of pricing impact associated with this de-reimbursement or price cuts, because we don't develop products to sustain that reimbursement. So I think, to me, that is probably one of the major changes and trends. Is no longer the regulatory path, is no longer just the innovation, look at what I have, is who's going to pay for it, and can that keep going for the life of the product? That's becoming more challenging.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, speaking to the sort of more smaller, innovative organizations that are developing products and don't actually even expect to bring them to market, but that has been one of the challenges, I think, as we look at assets moving forward and the valuations that are done in Europe, is the lack of understanding of the pricing world and valuations that potentially could get you today a U.S. price. I'm not even sure if tomorrow they will be able to evaluate that same thing. And how do we create that sense of awareness throughout the ophthalmology community, so that we make sure that we are as strong as a community and industry as we possibly can be.
And are there other key trends that need to be carefully followed? And I suppose I'm particularly thinking about market access trends and reimbursement trends, but are there other trends that are going to shape Europe over the coming years?
For me, the biggest one is COVID. and what are European healthcare systems going to do, and governments in general, as we start to move out of sort of the COVID crisis and the debts that we have seen ourselves in debt crises before now. We've always seen about a year and a half delay until we start to see the impacts on the healthcare system. And so it comes back to what I was saying earlier, is how do we make sure that within the European context that ophthalmology is considered as important a disease area to treat as those difficult decisions get made.
Yeah, and I guess that's the point earlier I made about partnerships, and collaboration, because this is going to be key, because I don't think it's just about the innovation, it's about how do we get ourselves out of this and to avoid, this situation where everybody blames COVID for the situation that we're in, right? Because pre-COVID, we had the same healthcare challenges and, in terms of expenditure, and in ophthalmology, it's never, it wasn't a life-threatening area, which where healthcare funds were diverted into other areas. But I guess for me, the critical piece will be how well do we partner with and collaborate, and at the same time to making sure that the right technology is allowed access. And the other area is, for example, with astigmatism. I do think in areas of astigmatism it needs to be treated across Europe. And we talked about dry eye, but I think that's another area where we are seeing companies, including Tim's, I guess, we are doing some great work around it. And we will have to see agencies willing to pay for reimbursement in that area.
Well, I'd also written down COVID, but from a slightly different perspective, because I wonder if the waiting lists that have now built up are not the thing that will kill the social healthcare system in Europe. If you look at the numbers, and I guess ophthalmology has to be a disproportionate contributor to those waiting list numbers, it's hard to imagine with the capacity levels that there were, how this will ever be caught up. And at some point, as waiting lists replace COVID on the front pages of newspapers, governments are going to have to make decisions about rationing healthcare. And I wonder if this one-stop shop system that we've had in Europe will migrate slowly to a rationed core service of government-funded healthcare, supplemented by an ever-increasing co-pay, private pay contribution. And actually that could have a really interesting impact on innovation, because if we look in our market and we look at IOLs, we know that co-pay and private pay is the driver of premium lens technology, for instance. So I think there's some positive elements of this COVID crisis that we've been through, as well as some complications.
Well, I certainly.
Go ahead, Fabrizio.
Thank you. No, I certainly agree with that. How we will recover from the COVID pandemic will be a key trend to follow, and I think our colleagues have already explained it all. Perhaps one thing that could play at an advantage is how we will be able to deploy from the pandemic experience the power of digital to address some of the underlying issues that we have also in the fragmentation in Europe, and it has an impact on the way healthcare is provided, and also how we can measure outcomes in a faster way to also be more credible as an industry to ask governments across Europe to change the way they reimburse products, which is rewarding inputs, not outputs, across the board. But this is especially important in ophthalmology, in my view, because a lot of products that we have are, especially if you look at the retail pharma side, kind of old products, but still you have a lot of variability. For example, and I think Luis is getting experience out of that, how different is the price of ophthalmic antibiotics across the different markets. And when it comes to, international price referencing and parallel trades that are other common features of being in a European Union, at least, this creates a lot of challenges that makes it very difficult to get reward for innovation. So I think those are also a couple of additional trends that we will have to carefully monitor to make sure that innovation is continued to be produced in Europe, if you allow me.
I think it's been well covered, Mark. The topic, I think Fabrizio made a very good point about technology. I think the only thing that I would like to add is we're embarking on the next 10 years of the life of something called Vision 2030. And there's a word that has come out of Japan called becoming a social innovator. And sometimes Japanese doesn't translate that well into English, but effectively what we're trying to say is that the patients we're going to be dealing with over the next 10 years are not the patients that we dealt with 10 years ago. The demands that Granddad has on us today will be different demands of the Granddad in 10 years' time. It will be someone that knows the medical device that he's been implanted, the drug that he's been given. He will have done research. He will have expectations much higher than what we have today. And as a company, we're trying to find ways to really think like patients do. And I know that all of us do, but quite often, at the last hurdle, we fail to do that. So that patient centricity, I think, is going to change us over the next 10 years. There will always be generics, there will always be copies in the marketplace, but it's a differentiation that the patient wants to have that will make the difference. And, if I go to my granddad, if I give him a mobile phone tomorrow, he will just take it. He won't care whether it's Apple or Samsung. The granddad of the future will want to know exactly how many gigs he's got and what kind of a system operation he's got, etc. So we're dealing with a different group of patients in terms of knowledge, awareness, and we need to be prepared for that. And that's a massive change that perhaps we haven't seen over the last 20 years, and technology is bringing to us today.
So as we head in just to the last few minutes of this panel discussion, it would be great to come back to that point of technological innovation and entrepreneurial activity in general in Europe. And I'm curious to get your opinions on let's say, the state of ophthalmic entrepreneurship in Europe in general. I'm not trying to imply that perhaps it's worse than anywhere else or better. I'm just curious to get your opinion on what do you think the state of entrepreneurship and innovation in ophthalmology is in Europe, and what do we need to do to further drive the innovation and the investment in innovation? And specifically, it'd be very interesting for all of the folks watching this panel discussion to also understand what are your companies doing to promote ophthalmic entrepreneurship outside of your in-house R&D department, so to speak. So it'd be great if each of you could provide an answer. Tim, would you like to start?
Well, we clearly don't have the resource of Luis, Karen, and Syed in our in-house innovation or R&D team. So it's absolutely incumbent upon us to have open collaborative networks. And, we've designed those from an intentional perspective. And at the moment, we sort of collaborate on 10 times more people than we have in-house, and that for us has proven to be very effective. So I suppose, given the time, my one comment would be just collaborate on everything with the minds of people that are smarter than you. And I think the state of networks and collaborative ventures in Europe is excellent right now. And actually, I would just quickly go on to say that for companies like, and I'd include CFI in this, I think that's a critical role that we play in the market, because that group of innovators who are looking for partners for whom they can continue to work on those projects, they can continue to nurture their babies through an R&D process to eventual launch. For companies for whom 30, 40, 50 million of revenue is a meaningful sum of money, but who have global presence to make an impact when the launch comes about. I think that's a critical role that companies of that sort of size play in the market.
Fabrizio, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I guess I would underwrite what Tim just said. Open innovation is key. I would also say that you cannot limit to Europe, wherever the innovation comes from, and this was something some other panelists mentioned during their contributions. You have to be open, and of course, how do you foster entrepreneurship in Europe? Maybe the one area that we've been fairly successful in is to make use of the available facilities for fostering cross-border R&D partnerships through the use of EU funds. And that's something that we have some experience on. It's getting more and more difficult to get a very successful collaboration. But still, this is an area where we as a CFI and Reiner could also be, leading some collaborative efforts. But
Luis, do you have thoughts?
I think what I can say is that the main objective is always to identify new thinking and emerging potential in development. Advanced technologies by themselves don't always appear automatically. They tend to be more like a combination of multiple innovations. We have established partnerships with Siri, with University College London. We've got Santen Ventures that invest into different companies because we believe that there is out there stuff that we don't know and we need to reach. And as an example, we created with Alphabet, the owners of Google, a company called 2020 Therapeutics, which basically is a 50-50 partnership with Santen, just looking at technologies and devices in ophthalmology that go well outside what anyone is thinking at universities or current research. It's just like beyond what is even potentially achievable. And I think it's that kind of open mind that we need to have. And this has been driven by Europe and Japan in combination. Our current CEO was the head of Europe before I came here. So he's got very much a European mind, although he's Japanese. And I think thinking in that way, thinking that there's something out there that we need to find, but can resolve an unmet need and clearly change the life of patients and the family is the motivation that we all in this panel have on a daily basis. I do think that we do have pressures to deliver the goals for the shareholders, for ultimately our bosses. But the reality is that what gives us pressure is an enjoyment is coming with something that no one has come up with before that meets that unmet need and can change the life of someone. And I think that's why we like this industry.
Sayed, from your perspective.
Yeah, I would say that, of course, we talked about having a good BD function, but, usually sort of entrepreneurs come to us, but the best source of knowledge of what could be addressing an unmet need is staying close to customers, to be honest. I think, customers often help us basically understand what could be interesting, and then you sort of take on the idea from there. So I think staying close to universities and to basically making sure that if there are opportunities to develop something together, that's also an open opportunity. But I think it's not the size of the company now, it's most probably how the idea will help address an unmet need, really, and then we can take it forward from there, as other people have said already.
Lastly but not least, Karen, your thoughts.
Thanks, Mark. And if I'm coming back to the question, I believe originally it was about digital innovations and Novartis. That has been one of our kind of key strategic pillars. Is looking at innovation. And in ophthalmology, I see there being really some huge opportunities, both from what Fabrizio talked about earlier in terms of how we collect outcomes we are doing a lot of retina AI work and looking at in our clinical development programs, how we can create those actionable insights and those outcomes so that we can actually even provide them to the payers from day one in terms of understanding what's happening. But I think also another exciting piece, which we didn't really touch upon today, is digital therapeutics. And ophthalmology is so well set up for this. And in Novartis, we acquired a company, small company from McGill, where we're looking at the potential through the use of video games to be able to treat amblyopia, which I think, really allows us both to collect real-time digital outcomes as we go, but also to start looking at potential new ways of treatments. So it's kind of exciting on both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, it certainly is. So thank you very much. With that, we conclude this panel discussion. I very much enjoyed being able to moderate your very insightful thoughts, and thank you all very much for agreeing to participate with us today. And thank you to everyone out there for listening to the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.